Thank you for joining me today. I think I have to be honest, I'm very happy with the title that I've used, The Democratization of Zero Days. Now, when I talk about the democratization of O days, I'm probably referring, or not probably, I am referring to the criminal element of democratizing O days. Because of course, for us as this information security industry, in fact, that level of transparency is going the other way, whereas historically, the publication of vulnerabilities and availability of exploits was ubiquitous with everything that we did. The advent and availability of organizations selling exploits now is beginning to increase. And so the asymmetry of access to O days is now fundamentally shifted and changed. So I'm Raj Samani, Senior Vice President here at Rapid7, but I'm also the Chief Innovation Officer for the Cloud Security Alliance, and I'm also co-author for the CSA Guide to Cloud Computing, which is just over a decade old now. So what we'll do today is actually we're going to talk about how the criminal fraternity are having access to more capable tools, and it's not just something that is specific to on-prem, but also cloud-based instances as well. And what you'll hear today are some of the latest vulnerabilities that we're seeing within the cloud environments. So let's get into it. Now, one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves is, I made this bold assertion right at the beginning in which I said, well, look, criminals are having access to more tools and more capabilities than they've ever had before. And one of the questions that you will probably quite rightly ask is, well, why? I mean, how are they getting better? Are they all of a sudden creating like a criminal university where they go in and teach people how to like log into RDP? The answer is probably not. I mean, it wouldn't be the most exciting course if it was. But actually, the reason that they're improving is because we, and I say we collectively, but we as a society are paying criminals. Now, I know what you're thinking. Yes, but we've been told not to pay ransoms. We've been told not to interact with criminals. And whilst that may be true for you or I, there's many organizations across the globe that have been paying enormous sums of money to criminals. And beyond just simply going out and purchasing cars and very expensive designer clothes and watches and so forth, one of the things that they're doing is that they are actually investing in the acquisition of working exploits that have not been made public yet, i.e. the O day. Now, how bad is the situation? Well, let's look at last year, for example. Now, 5,939 leak posts. What does that actually mean? Well, it means that there were 6,000 companies that were compromised by ransomware groups and 6,000 companies that had their data stolen. And that data was posted on a leak post that was then used to extort money from the victim. 6,000 companies. And, let's be under no illusion, that is just the tip of the iceberg. Those 6,000 posts were spread across 75 active ransomware groups, and about 45 of them are active at any one time. Now, when I said that we're paying them, and by the way, I've got to stop using the words we, because that infers that I am personally paying them. I just want to be clear, I'm not actually paying ransomware threat actors. Like society and organizations that are compromised are paying them. The average ransomware demand is, at the end of Q3 2024 was about just under $500,000, and 1 in 3 companies were paying. And that's a lot. And what does that mean? Well, fundamentally, it means that because of that, there are lots and lots of criminals out there carrying out ransomware. And of course, it stands to reason that if you pay criminals, they will do more crime. I don't think that's a stretch. And to put it into perspective, from November until kind of middle of January, each of those dots represent a campaign. So it's not one company that's compromised. It's actually a campaign of attacks that they carry out against organizations from all across the globe to all varying sectors. And what you'll see is there are some that will come in and just, go out, compromise a bunch of companies, make some cash, do something else. They'll be in and out, right? And you can see that at the top. And by the way, this is the dashboard that we use within Rapid7 Labs to track threat actors, specifically organized criminal groups that are carrying out and conducting ransomware. On the bottom, you see a group like Ransom Hub, who I'm sure you've heard of before. The Ransom Hub crew are very active, and they remain very active. Throughout the year of 2024, that kind of line of dots or circles, that's been fairly consistent over the course of the year. Now, we estimate that the Ransom Hub group have made about $41 million based upon the median average of $200,000 of ransomware payments. So in other words, the first part of this that you can take from is we are paying criminals. As a result of that, they are investing. And one of the things that they're doing, and one of the areas that they're investing in, are ways to break into more companies. For example, historically, the most common entry vector to a company used to be the remote desktop protocol. Now, 1 in 3 of these attacks are vulnerability exploitation. In other words, they are finding the vulnerabilities, the external facing vulnerabilities of organizations. They're exploiting said vulnerabilities, breaking in, and effectively stealing your data and encrypting your information. Now, this isn't something that they have have always been doing. As I mentioned, the most common entry vector was they used to log in. Now, they exploit vulnerabilities. And of course, part of the challenge that we face about this all is that the reason that they're going down this path, and this is kind of like a fairly new phenomenon, really from kind of May 2023, and we'll get into that later, is because they were doing this because, of course, they're now having access to exploits. And when I mention this word, the democratization of exploits, what we'll see in just a minute is they're purchasing these exploits and they're enabling their ecosystem to be able to go out and carry out these attacks. Now, what does that mean? Well, here's just some example of just a couple of vulnerabilities used by ransomware groups. By the way, there are many, 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 many more. But what do we mean by the democratization? Well, look, let's just rewind a bit. And if we go kind of 2016 and before, what used to happen was there was a direct correlation between the ransomware developer and the victim. In other words, what happened was there would be an individual or a group of individuals that would develop code, that would do reconnaissance, go through targeted delivery, and then encrypt the systems of the victims and then demand a ransom. It wasn't very high. I use the word high ransom kind of loosely. Approximately 2 Bitcoin, which at the time was about $400. Now that all began to change because what we started to move towards is this kind of cybercrime as a service, this cybercrime ecosystem. And all of a sudden they started to introduce a group of individuals that would be part of the criminal conspiracy to go out and defraud companies across the globe. This middleman and women, these are called affiliates. And think of affiliates more like they're the individuals that have the skills that know how to break into organizations. The ransomware developers were the ones that would create the tools, and the affiliates would be the ones that would basically smash the back window, break into a company, and steal the TV out of the back door. So the ransomware developers really began to kind of have this almost arm's length from the victims themselves. They would, in many cases, they would interview affiliates to determine their technical prowess. They would give them the ransomware itself, the code itself, in order to encrypt. And they would even provide a very handy dashboard that would allow affiliates the opportunity to manage their victims. So it was very much like a proper cloud-based service. But what was interesting now, and I think if we kind of start moving forward, was, historically the affiliates would be very good at breaking into companies and the ransomware developers would basically create the code. But what's happening now is when we talk about the democratization of O-Days, the fascinating part of all of this is that they are making those tools, the exploits, available to affiliates. In other words, they're enabling the affiliates with the tools in order to be able to how to break into an organization. Kind of think about like, if we use the analogy of breaking into a house, well, the ransomware developers are effectively giving affiliates the master key that allows them to open any front door or back door for a victim, and effectively democratizing the accessibility of malicious code. And of course, the money that they're having is basically being used to fund more development. Now, this is the dark side crew. You may recognize them as Black Matter. This was the group that were responsible for the Colonial Pipeline instance. And what you can see is they are carrying out development 12 hours a day, 5 days a week, and they've got a well-coordinated and a very large team developing new innovations as well as bypassing capabilities. So, when we said earlier, why are criminals getting better? Well, because we're paying them, and by paying them, they can continue to develop more capabilities, more features, and more bypassing capabilities. And so, like, the challenge we're facing as a society, of course, is how do we kind of move away from this kind of world? And, when we start talking about the construct of O-Days, what we can see is the average time to known exploitation is actually only decreasing. So in other words, by paying them more, they're able to develop exploits quicker and faster. Now, you're probably thinking, well, that's great, Raj. I've come to a Cloud Security Alliance webinar and you haven't even talked about the word cloud once at all. To stress, the identification and accessibility of vulnerabilities isn't just, solely used by, you target like on-premise solutions. Equally, the identification of vulnerabilities that can potentially be exploited equally applies to cloud. And for example, just now we're seeing, a number of vulnerabilities in Ingress NGINX controllers for Kubernetes. And the challenge we face with these particular ones is, of the 5 that are disclosed, CVE 24514, which is 8.8 high, 1097, again 8.8 high, and 1098 can actually be chained with 1974 to achieve remote code execution on the Kubernetes pod. The challenge we face about this one is 43% of cloud environments are vulnerable to the issue disclosed, and there's about 6,500 clusters with publicly exposed Ingress controllers. Now, here's the thing. These particular ones aren't being exploited in the wild. I mean, there is, at the time of recording, there is one proof of concept exploit available, and probably by the time you're looking at this, it's probably, that may well have changed. But of course, the need to understand the rapid availability and accessibility of critical vulnerabilities and understanding the intelligence around that is now becoming an absolute crucial component of what we do. Partly because they're being rapidly exploited by criminals, as we saw earlier. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, that's great. You are basically saying to us that we just need to go out and patch. And you know what? That's a typical approach. The typical approach will be, we've heard about a particular vulnerability and we'll go out and patch it. I would have to stress that I think now we need to start thinking slightly differently as to how we do things. Now, by the way, look, this is the coverage that we rolled out this morning. And as you can see, for an organization, they'll look at it and they'll go, oh, okay, look, I've looked at my environment and I can identify that there are a number of systems that are vulnerable to this. I should go out and I need to go out and patch it. But the challenge that I think you have to ask yourself is, was the vulnerability being exploited in the wild? In other words, like, what was it? It was 25th of March that the advisory came out. If the vulnerability being exploited in the wild, then the likelihood is criminals would have had it, days, weeks, months before. So going down this old typical of approach, which is like, oh, I need to go and patch my systems, it's probably too late, because then if it had been exploited in the wild, what you need to be able to do is to start to think to yourself, well, okay, well, if we've remained vulnerable and we're applying patches today, but the criminals have known about it for some time, there is every chance that potentially threat actors are inside my environment. So all of a sudden, we start to get to this world around, I know some of you are going to start switching off now, but like threat intelligence. This is where threat intelligence starts to become crucial, because what you need to be understanding at this particular point is the context with regards to the advisories. If the context reveals that it's exploited in the wild, then therefore just simply going out and patching your systems is not enough. What needs to happen is an exercise to undertake retroactive threat hunting to determine whether threat actors are still inside your environment. Here's a little example of what I mean by that. We've got to effectively evolve the way that we consider things like threat intelligence. Threat intelligence is not reading a 30-page PDF about a threat actor group operating in Southeast Asia targeting, I don't know, like the mining industry, unless you're in the mining industry, that is. Because quite frankly, it's not relevant. What's required are real-time insights. In other words, okay, I've read about this particular issue. I know remote code execution is possible. I know that a proof of concept exploit is out there, but actually it's not being exploited. There's no evidence of exploitation in the wild. Therefore, patching the system will be enough. However, if the real-time insights reveal that actually it has been exploited, and if you think of the Move IT, and we'll get to that in a second, and it's been exploited for a period of time, then maybe the challenge now becomes, well, okay, patching is not going to be enough. Maybe what I need to start thinking about is, how do I undertake a retroactive threat hunt to determine whether threat actors are already in my environment? So I would argue that threat intelligence demands real-time insights with actionable threat mitigation. Maybe you can start thinking about automating security patches and so forth. That's a different presentation. I think that might take a bit longer than 30 minutes. So what does this mean? Well, I would argue that some of the questions that you will be asking yourself, and more importantly, not just the questions that you will ask yourself, but the questions that you need answers to that will determine your response, will be as follows. Number one, is the vulnerability being actively exploited? So real-time threat intelligence or actionable intelligence. What's the campaign? Is the vulnerability being exploited in the wild? If so, does that mean that for us as an organization, if it's being exploited, we need to change the way that we assess and we prioritize the patching and remediation? Because if it's being exploited, you probably want to patch it quicker than, for example, if it's not. The second question is prevalence tracking. Which sectors and what geographies are they going after? Chances are, if it's being exploited and it's targeting your sector and your geography, you pretty much want to be able to, this is the point where you start to wake up the analysts and kick off a change request to do, an emergency patch to your production systems pretty quickly. By the way, I will tell you, if they're annoyed that they're being woken up at 3 a.m. because of this, have them live through a real-life ransomware case, for example, and I can tell you, it's a very different level of stress. And then the third point is, is a proof of concept exploit available? In other words, is it going to be potentially exploited in the wild in the coming hours, weeks, or months? And getting these insights and getting this context, I realize, is not easy. I do something which, so obviously at Rapid7, one of the things that we do is we've got probably one of the most comprehensive open source frameworks. You all heard of Metasploit, you'll heard of Velociraptor. Now, one of the other things that we have that we provide free, by the way, to the industry, so this is not a sales pitch, you'll be pleased to hear, is we have Attacker KB. Now, Attacker KB is our open platform, and I want to stress it's an open platform for vulnerability research and intelligence. The objective of Attacker KB is to analyze all of the critical CVEs, and critical not by CVSS, but critical by things like exploited in the wild. Is it remote code execute? Does it have an RCE? Identifying the things that you should be concerned about, real vulnerability intelligence. What we do within that is we'll flag all of the critical CVEs, and we will determine and provide tags so that you can identify whether it's been exploited in the wild. We'll also introduce tags as to include whether the vulnerability is included in SysAkev. The other thing we'll do is we'll tell you the type of threat actor that we believe to be behind it. So if it's ransomware or if it's a nation state group. And the other thing is we'll tell you if there's a working POC exploit available as well. Now, what does that mean and why should that matter? Well, look, the truth of the matter is I think, for those of you that are listening to this that are, involved with vulnerability management in your organization, I feel for you. You've probably got tens of thousands of vulnerabilities on your risk register that you need to patch that, quite frankly, we'll never see a patch as long as we can live, because it's just too much. The challenge we have is that we've got to start to prioritize what requires remediation and what can be delayed with regards to remediation. Delayed is a polite way of saying ones that we'll just get round to one day. And one can argue that what needs to be patched and what needs to be prioritized shouldn't just solely be based on CVSS. In fact, what I'm actually suggesting is that none of it's based on CVSS. Because, take the Kubernetes issues from earlier. Is that something that you're going to go out and roll out, updates for to production systems, potentially jeopardizing the accessibility and availability of critical production systems that your business depends upon? I probably wouldn't say yes. Now, that all depends upon your risk appetite. But if you have 5 critical vulnerabilities that could be exploited and that there's a working exploit for, but aren't being used by criminals, one might say you can actually take a minute to do the assessment and determine whether, what the impact of the business will be to in terms of rolling out those updates. But if you focused everything just upon CVSS, you saw, you had a couple of 8.8s. I think the other one was a 9.8, 1974. The chances are you're probably going to try and remediate as quickly as you can. But again, this comes down to your risk appetite as an organization. Now, what's going to change your approach and what's going to change your prioritization? If you identify the fact that actually those exploits are being used in the wild. And if they are, then you pretty much need to implement remediation straight away. And again, this is what we mean by actionable intelligence. The second that, there are indicators that potentially those vulnerabilities are being used in the wild, that's when your prioritization path changes. We talk about threat intelligence and actionable intelligence, but what we're really talking about here is true vulnerability intelligence integrated with operational outcomes and outputs for an organization, whether that's on-prem, whether that's off-prem. And to be honest with you, that advisory coming out this week was a little bit like Christmas, because I knew I had this talk coming up, and it was the perfect example where we kind of look at something and say, hey, it's critical and everyone's talking about it and social media is blowing up. And I used to say Twitter, I don't say that anymore, but social media is blowing up. And the natural response for us as security teams will be like, oh my gosh, wake everybody up, sound the alarm, do something. In this particular instance, it's like, well, yeah, we probably should be looking at it, and we probably do need to prioritize it, but we probably don't need to bring down our production instances today because it's not being widely exploited. And the reason, and thank you, Sophos, for your research, but the reason that we need to start thinking like this, and we need to start thinking about there's a lot of discussion around, automated patching. And I get automated patching anything automated is scary, right? I get that. But look, dwell time is decreasing. The amount of time threat actors are inside the network is only reducing. The majority of attacks now, according to Sophos, are conducted between Tuesday and Thursday, but outside of business hours. So if a vulnerability and an alert does come out about something at, midnight, and you're not thinking about automated patching based upon the criticality and capabilities of threat groups and the artifacts that they're using, by the time you get into work at 8:30 in the morning, it'll be too late. So we do need to start thinking slightly differently as to how we do things. And the way that we mitigate the potential impact and risk of an automated patch or an automated update disrupting production systems is by mitigating and limiting what we actually automate and what we don't. So therefore, for those things that are critical, that are being exploited, that are targeting your sector, stuff like that, you might want to take a business decision and say, well, look, we'll have to do something in the middle of the night, right? There's just no way around it. So we've got to start thinking slightly differently. And look, the example I want to give you, and I did promise this earlier. Look, we've got a bunch of resources and tools available, and I want to use the Move IT O-Day as the example. So when the Move IT file transfer vulnerability came out, obviously we got detections out, we got vuln checks out, but what we also did was we actually published Velociraptor artifacts to the community. In other words, free of charge. So we had curated threat hunting rules made available. We also produced curated threat hunting rules to identify what had been exfilled out of the network. Obviously, analysis, coverage, and a working exploit integrated with Metasploit was equally made available to the community. I really appreciate your time kind of listening to me. And the one thing that I can give you in return by taking 30 minutes out of your time to listen to me is we'll give you access to resources like Metasploit. We'll give you access to resources like Velociraptor. We'll give you, the tools that you can use to threat hunt. So when people say, hey, listen, are we covered for it? Well, that's great. But have we been impacted? You can answer that question in minutes. Oh, we've been impacted. Do we know what was stolen? Well, in this instance, yes, we do know what was stolen. Do we know who was behind the threat? Yes, well, we do actually, because our emergent threat response and our publications that we make available goes through things such as attribution. Can you tell me how the exploit works? Well, yeah, go to Attacker KB. We'll give you a full breakdown of everything and the way that it was exploited. So links to some of these resources are available here. Look, thank you so much. I'm a huge supporter of the Cloud Security Alliance, as you would kind of imagine, having written and co-authored the book on it. But all I can say is that criminals are getting better, and it's not we that are paying, but others, right? Let's just call it others. But other people are enabling criminals. The best way that we can work together to try to mitigate or prevent these types of activities is by getting better data, better insights, and quicker responses. So with that, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the summit.